David, this is real. This possibility, or you'll help me calibrate how real it is. But the notion that Trump might get tossed off the ballot in a couple of states, it only probably would take one, because of violations of the 14th Amendment. It was talked about, but now it's actually going to trial?
Right. CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, and some other parties have brought a case in Colorado. Now, why they chose Colorado first, I don't know. But the core of their argument is that Trump doesn't need to be convicted of a crime. He doesn't need a judicial finding. In fact, he doesn't actually, although I don't think they concede this in the papers, have to engage in insurrection. The 14th Amendment's Article 3 or Section 3 only requires that you give aid or comfort to insurrectionists. And I think it's pretty difficult to argue that Trump did not give aid or comfort to the insurrectionists. Now, we're in an area here that is largely untested. There was a New Mexico state court that removed a county commissioner who had been involved in the January 6th insurrection under this clause. The Trump lawyers, of course, say this is a ridiculous interpretation of the law. Well, I think the plain reading of the law is very clear. Trump is not eligible because he gave aid and he gave comfort. The law says or, but aid or comfort to the insurrectionists. And this case will almost certainly end up before the U.S. Supreme Court, even though our Constitution says that states are in charge of their elections unless Congress passes legislation specifically addressing this, like the Voting Rights Act that was largely gutted by the Supreme Court. I would expect that at least one state somewhere will keep him off the ballot, probably more than one. But if it's in a state he's likely to win, Louisiana, it would be an irrelevancy. It would be very relevant. If it's in a state like New York, Massachusetts, or California, where he has no prospect of winning.
It doesn't matter if he's on the ballot or not there.
It doesn't matter if he's on the ballot or not, exactly, because he won't get those electoral college votes. The troubling part of this is that there is far more support being found by pollsters for Trump than makes any kind of logic or sense. Emotionally understandable, but not on the basis on which the founders and the framers set up our country, which was a reasoned, factual debate. Now, the polls do show that if you ask sideways questions, not, do you support Trump or Biden, but where are you on various things, his support falls away. So a fair amount of indication that support is pretty soft, number one. Number two, as I think I've mentioned on your show before, we have good reason not to think that political polls are currently reliable because less than 1 in 100 people who are contacted by telephone will take the poll. And John Geraci, who's a pollster here in Rochester, we have a long history of big pollsters being based here in Rochester because of commercial interests. In his book, Poll, P-O-L-L, Arised, goes into the reasons that for political polls, we should be very skeptical of their nature. But that said, clearly there are huge numbers of people who support Trump. On the other side of that, his rallies, as we first started documenting at DC Report several years ago, they're drawing smaller crowds, and the crowds are made up more of the people who travel from rally to rally as regulars.
Yeah, those who like the show, sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, David. I want to get to the rallies and his support and the way it seems to be evaporating, and also who he is now in a second. But I wanted to ask you about what you touched on. One of the virtues, I thought, of U.S. elections and the system, and there are a lot of things that are not virtuous, is this state thing that you're talking about, that essentially, the feds can't meddle too much with the states unless it's a civil rights thing, as you suggested. So it's interesting to me that on a question like this, it would be bumped up to the federal level. Is that odd, or is that wrong?
Yeah, there will absolutely be an appeal to try and get it to the federal courts. The Trump people will do that without question. They may get rejected. If they get rejected by a district court judge, they'll go to the Court of Appeals that's based in Denver, and then they would try and appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, which takes only a tiny fraction of the cases presented to it. And I would be surprised if the Supreme Court took this up, but who knows?
So that would be the play then, David, that the Supreme Court wouldn't take it up, and then you'd end up with the lower courts having decided. That's
correct. Yeah, I mean, I think that normally the Supreme Court doesn't take up issues unless there is a major conflict between district courts of appeal. So the Court of Appeal in Denver for the Rocky Mountain states and the Court of Appeal in San Francisco for California and I think it's Oregon have different interpretations of the same issue.
Sure.
They rarely take up a case where there's no dispute among districts, appellate districts. But we're in uncharted waters here. And I don't think Trump's argument that the law doesn't apply to him has much substance. The Constitution says what the Constitution says, and certainly Justices Gorsuch and Coney Barrett and Thomas are going to be hit with an argument that, well, you've invented this, major issues doctrine and would not help Trump. But, unfortunately, we have a court, the high court, that is both very political now. Courts are always somewhat political based on who appointed the justices, but very political. And more importantly, we have one for sure, Clarence Thomas, and possibly two utterly corrupt judges on the court. Thomas, if he was on any other court, would have been removed by now.
Yeah,
I come from regular stock.
yeah, right. Go ahead, Kim.
I have a question. So, reading the text of the 14th Amendment, and I'll just reiterate it, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president or vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or an officer of the U.S. or as any member of state legislature, blah, 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 swore to support the Constitution shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. So you don't have to be convicted of it.
Right.
Who decides? Who's the arbiter of like whether you're an insurrectionist or have provided aid or comfort or not?
Courts are going to decide that. Judges are going to decide that. This was passed, remember, in an era when the South lost.
Right.
Many people in the South were not at all willing to submit to the fact that they had lost. The people had to carry papers if they were not deemed to be enemies of the country, and Army troops, up until I think it was 1872, they would stop people, white people, and ask for their papers to establish whether they were active enemies of the U.S. And I would argue that there are many people in the South and some in the legislature who are, in fact, dedicated enemies of the United States government, including the speaker, the current speaker, Mike Johnston.
Wow.
Because by their actions, they make it clear that Johnson was one of the leading people in the effort to overthrow the government in 2020. Now, he wasn't on the physical insurrection side. He was on the legal side of coming up with arguments. But
then under this 14th Amendment, he shouldn't be where he is either.
I would agree. But, as a practical matter, laws are not generally enforced. OK, a minority of people who commit murders go to prison. When the police tell you they solved a crime, all that means is they're convinced that they know who did it, and they may not even be able to arrest that person because they don't have enough evidence of it. And so this is a matter of, priorities and issues that people want to bring. But the people at Crew have been very successful so far in their lawsuits to obtain documents to change various things. They've lost some cases, but overall they have a very solid track record, which tells you they have good lawyers. Donald, on the other hand, has been reduced to being represented by not very good lawyers. And the very good lawyers he used to have, people like Ty Cobb, the grandson of the great baseball player, Bill Barr, his attorney general, have, essentially said Trump belongs in prison. He's committed crimes. He should be convicted. And when convicted, he should go to prison.
It's interesting that Kim points to what is the obvious fact, that the new Speaker of the House is, full-on insurrectionist, as you say, on the legal side. But if I can segue into the politics of the new Speaker, I have a question for you, which is, this guy doesn't line up David K. Johnston with any and I know we've run down polls, but I mean, people have spoken with their vote. I mean, in the midterms, when you look at Roe v. Wade, and I think the ripple effects of this intense Christian right movement in this country legislatively, that's come back and bitten the Republicans. Yet this guy is the head of the spear. I mean, he's unbelievable. I think he, because people don't know him very well, he's sort of gotten away with it. But he's really, as he's a diehard. So my question to you is, if the Democrats get the word out more about who Mike Johnson is, might that be, just get more light into this guy's life and where he stands? Might that be a political winner?
Well, maybe, and the other side maybe, because, well, the theory of our government is that people are educated, informed, engage in debate, robust, rigorous, often crude debate, but nonetheless debate about the facts. That's not true of a lot of the American population, unfortunately. Mitt Romney said many people in his party, the Republican Party, don't believe in democracy. Mike Johnson is a white Christian nationalist. So understand what that means. He's not a Christian. If you're a Christian, you don't hold the views that he does. And I would argue he's not even a nationalist. He's a tribalist. He wants people who think like him to be in control. You combine him with the Supreme Court adopting this new major doctrine, and that, if something wasn't the habit of the country at the time of its founding or doesn't have a deep tradition, we can't have it. These are people who would bring back marital rape, wife beating. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that wife beating was routine in this country. It still goes on, but it was routine. I attended a state legislative hearing in San Francisco in the late 70s, where women from wealthy households whose husbands beat them, one was a bank president and another was successful in, I forget, some other very high-level field, beat them, and they testified about this. Unfortunately, the news coverage out of that, since my story was killed by the LA Times, was only about the women from blue-collar or farm worker or other poor backgrounds whose husband beat them, because a lot of people couldn't imagine that wealthy men would do this sort of thing. And in Mike Johnson, you have someone who wants government. He says he's for freedom, but he wants government to control women's bodies. He wants to get rid of the social safety network. And look at the latest thing that the Republicans are proposing here: aid to Israel. Wherever you are on the issue about Israel and Hamas and the way the Israelis are prosecuting the war, the U.S. government's going to support Israel in this matter. But he wants to finance it by cutting the budget of the IRS dollar for the money that goes to Hamas. Who benefits from cutting the IRS budget? Very wealthy tax cheats. And the rest of us pay the price through higher taxes, fewer government services, and annoyance in trying to deal with an underfunded IRS with inadequate technology. I mean, these people hate the United States of America as it is. And Johnson is a good example of this. There's a video of he and his wife on what appears to be the stage of a church for more than an hour, and professing their views. And one of their views is that this is a Christian nation. No, it's not. Twice in the Constitution, we explicitly make clear it's not. But this lie is so deeply believed by many people in America that it's become a major political problem for the country.
Yeah, and invoking, the word of the divine to somehow justify, whatever interpretation you have of the good book. And by the way, when asked about his policies and his sort of legislative disposition, he says, "Get a Bible. That's my legislative disposition."
Yeah. So presumably he's in favor of, well, in fact, he is in favor of criminalizing homosexual conduct. He would eliminate same-sex marriage. And if you want to go further, I guess he'll, want men to be able to sell their daughters into slavery and to execute children who speak disrespectfully to their parents, because you can find all that in the Bible.
In that spirit, David, you make the point that notwithstanding that, people vote on personality, on emotion, often, they're single issue voters as well. And so I don't know, as I was saying, I think if you shed more light on this and, it's talked about more, then at least it gets out there. I don't know at the end of the day, to use the, now tired phrase, how it has an effect on the election, on various elections in various places, and certainly the presidential election.
Yeah, I think that, just a second, I've got it. Sorry, I thought I turned off.
It's okay, it's fine. Yeah, the effect on the election, I don't know.
Yeah, well, the fundamental most important thing is people vote their pocketbook. V.O. Key, in the book published after he died, it came out about 1962, lays out, showing persuasively, going back through many elections, that in presidential elections, people vote their pocketbook. I was surprised the other day when I spoke at the Stop Trump Summit in New York City that Stuart Stevens, who was Romney's campaign manager, had never heard of V.O. Key. But his findings are sort of fundamental. The economy is doing incredibly well, but that isn't something that resonates with people, especially if you're in the bottom half or 2/3, because much of the inflation we have is with food and fuel.
Right. And so that really hits you.
Airline fares go down or hotel fares go down.
Sure.
That doesn't affect a large segment of the population. The Dobbs decision hopefully will not have worn through. That should motivate people to go to the polls in large numbers.
And that's incumbent upon the Democrats to remind.
Turn out the vote. Elections are about two things: getting people registered and keeping them now registered because of all the efforts to purge voter rolls, and then getting them to actually go to the polls or to vote. Jennifer and I just voted early here in New York in our local elections. Judges, school boards, things like that.
Sure.
But large numbers of people don't vote. The Republican primaries in Louisiana, apparently less than 40% turnout. And that's how you get people like Mike Johnston, who represent a minority viewpoint, but they get out their supporters to vote. And the Republicans have, I admire how they have spent the last 40 years building up an infrastructure, building up a bench by running people for everything from mosquito abatement district and school board to county elections clerk, while the Democrats, have not paid attention to their knitting. And I've been directly critical of the Democrats about they're not paying attention to these things, and they're not making it clear, in my view, on a marketing level, that the policies being pursued by people like Mike Johnston are beneficial only to the best off among us, and that the policies the Democrats have are beneficial to people further down the income ladder. And you may recall that Barack Obama met a guy now dead who called himself Joe the Plumber, in Toledo, Ohio, and almost word for word out of one of my books, he tried to explain to him that under the Obama tax plan, this guy would be able to save more money to start a business and be much better off. And if you watch the whole 12-minute thing on YouTube, the astonishing part is the other guy isn't listening to him. He has a perspective. Obama bad. Doesn't matter what the facts are. And this is one of the core problems here is it doesn't matter what the facts are. I'm angry. And boy, do we have a lot of angry people in this country across the spectrum. There are plenty of people who think of themselves as progressives who are really angry. And it's a sign, I think, of the mismanagement of our economy and our government, that's been going on for the last 40 some years.
Well, and then when there's mismanagement, David, I would respectfully suggest that there is a blame game that goes on, but it goes on now with an arch quality that that is fueled by social media. I don't mean to make social media the boogeyman all the time, but yeah.
I agree. I am always stunned when I put up something I know will be controversial on either my Facebook page or my Twitter page or Threads, although there are a lot of people there, at the responses I get from people who don't like it. Very few of them are reasoned.
Right.
And they're generally, well, you're a POS or something else crude. Right. There's no substance there, and they're often factually wrong. I especially love the people who put up that, well, obviously I'm a communist who hates capitalism. Gee, I wrote a best-selling trilogy defending actual capitalism and denouncing corporate socialism, and some guy posted on my feed the other day, well, just because you said you denounced it doesn't mean you're not in favor of it. It's like,
I didn't see that. I check out your feed. I think your stuff's funny too. You also include some funny stuff. You can see we have it up there if you want to check out David on X or whatever. It's at David KJ. But listen, I only have another minute with you, so let me just quickly ask. There's another thing we haven't touched on, and I thought of you as Trump begins to break down mentally. He doesn't know where he is. Now the stuff's advertised. He confuses these different autocrats that he loves so much, and I wanted to ask you the most recent one, his gaffe of the Sioux Falls and Sioux City, as he campaigns in Iowa. As he shows sort of the same kind of gaffe-prone moves that we ascribe to like a Biden, might there be a real chink in the Trump armor, or is it just truly immovable?
Well, there's a group of people who can be moved. The pure Trumpers are not going to be moved. The people who, admire Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump together are not going to be moved. But clearly there are people who can be broken off and persuaded on a policy level to be away from Trump. That doesn't solve the underlying problem. There are a whole bunch of people in line behind Trump who would still create a government of the rich, by the rich, for the rich. In fact, that's not even accurate. By the billionaire class, for the billionaire class, against everybody else. And that's a function of what's gone wrong with campaign finance, both in disclosure terms and in the Supreme Court's position that money and speech are equatable.
But as a threat to democracy, David, do you see a distinction between Trump and those who are on the bench behind him?
Some of them there is, some of them there are not. I don't think Nikki Haley is as troubling as Donald Trump, but Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, and Mike Johnston, I think they're a serious threat. I think this is going to be a very long-term challenge to our liberties, because there are all sorts of people who want liberty for my group, and you will do what we allow. And that's what all of the post-war movements by minorities, particularly Black people, by women, and by LGBTQ plus people have been about, is expanding the franchise, expanding the notion of liberty on a practical level. And a lot of people want to stuff that back in the box. And if they get the opportunity, they will.
I know we lose you for a week. You're taking a week off. You deserve it. You really deserve it. But we so appreciate our time with you, and I guess we'll talk to you in 2 weeks, right?
2 weeks. Talk to you in 2 weeks.
Good stuff. David K. Johnston, everybody. Thanks, David, so much. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.